First one is the perception of those who experience crime and or violence. So again, while most feel sympathy towards victims who have experienced crime and or violence, sometimes we blame the victim for their plight. One reason for this is the need to believe in a just world. Primarily when you look at individuals, at times we end up looking at the victim saying, it's their fault. Um, they were the one who chose that relationship. They were the ones who got into that type of interaction, or they're the ones who it was their initial fault. And so that's one of the things we kind of look at when we look at victimology. And again, at times it unburdens us as well. Because again, we also look at it from the element of they're accountable for their own lives. So that's one of the things is it kind of just distance, can't even say the word. It distances ourselves from them. Initially, we kind of have an us or them kind of mentality. Therefore, we kind of look at victims and simply say, yeah, you know what, it was their own fault. It doesn't necessarily affect me because it's outside of my initial realm. Therefore, I don't really want to worry about it too much. Therefore, I will distance myself from an individual. Now, perception of those who experience crime. Generally, when considering someone else's actions, we use dispositional attribution that focus on the person's ability, personality, or even temporary states. In other words, fatigue as explanations for the conduct in question. In other words, if people are responsible for their own suffering, we feel less obligated to help them. Usually that's one of the things we start to distance ourselves. So again, the types of victims. In 2015, approximately 10 million households experienced at least one property crime, and 2.7 million individuals were victimized by crimes of violence. Within that, the overall rate of violent victimization has decreased substantially between 1993 and 2015, from a rate of over 75 per 1,000 to under 25 per 1,000 citizens. So you're seeing a decrease in terms of violent victimization. You know. The type of crimes have also initially changed. We're also looking at hate crimes. So within that, you have legislators that have been increasingly concerned about the proliferation of hate crimes. Criminal acts intended to harm or intimidate people because of their race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, or other minority group status. So again, when I look at individuals, I'm always looking at the element of when we talk about the LGBTQ community. Initially, the short term, I used to just utilize gender and sexual minorities. So within that, you have individuals who are involved in hate crimes based upon their sexual orientation. Within that, the federal government and 45 states have enacted laws that allow stiffer sentencing for defendants convicted of hate crimes. On the reservation, do we see hate crimes? Yeah, we do see it in terms of plan system, in terms of individuals who are very staunch in their belief system, traditionalism versus individuals who are non-traditionalists, and those different elements as well. And so again, you also see those uniquenesses happening on the reservation as well. Within that type of victims, victimization of the LGBTQ community, 65% of students indicated that they had been harassed during the last year. 39% reported harassment due to their appearance, and 33% said they were harassed because of their actual or perceived sexual orientation. You have individuals who go about believing that one, if you remember, I think it was Friends, initially within that, for the gender sexual minorities, you have individuals who believe that they have what is considered an internal radar that can detect whether or not an individual is of the gender sexual minorities. Again, one of the things that when you even look at that account, you're initially discriminate. So this is that level of discrimination. So again, you have individuals who are looking from all different types initially in terms of their action, and it's that the perceivement. So that's where you have individuals who are initially applying that level of intimidation and everything else, and therefore it goes to the area of what is considered a hate crime. You also have the aspect of calling people names, whether it be derogatory names, and you have individuals coming from different angles. Now, LGBT students were 3 times as likely to report feeling unsafe at school, 22% versus 70% of non-LGBT students. and 1.5 times as likely to have been harassed. More teachers, the students reported that they considered bullying or harassment to be a serious problem at their school. From my time being a counselor, working around a K through 12 school system, that was one of the things we always saw. Individuals who were bullied, and so within that, that was one of the huge factors that I was always facing when I was counseling as a school behavior intervention counselor. Within that, you had individuals who and this was one of those things where you also saw it from teachers, teachers against students in terms of bullying. And that's one of the uniquenesses. Is you had individuals who did not like a student or did not like how a student was acting based upon their behaviors. And therefore, they felt that one, they should not act in that way, or they should not act in terms of that initial orientation. Therefore, they should be ousted from that classroom. And again, it's one of those things where you had individuals coming from different elements and different viewpoints. And primarily within that, you saw the different uniquenesses within a school setting. So now, technological advancements. One, you have individual cyber stalking, cyber bullying, you have identity theft. And again, within that, one of the big factors, and this will be coming up later on in the series. This will be, I believe, in the second half of after the initial fall break and everything else. But after that, we'll be looking at the uniquenesses of technology, cyberbullying, implemented through technology, and we'll be looking at different laws in regards to cyberbullying and everything else. We won't go in depth right now. We'll go in depth at a later time, and this will look at laws on the reservation that kind of have been implemented. And so within that, you have identity theft. But one of the things with a lot of the technological advancements has been the aspect of anonymity. You have individuals who feel like they're cyber warriors or keyboard warriors initially because one, they're able to see everything they need to say online without ever having to face any consequences. But as you notice, a lot of times the technological advancements has also brought about new changes in law. Even on the reservation, you have changes in law, and we'll talk about that later on in the next couple of weeks in terms of the changes in terms of technological advancements and the law itself, and how we are initially looking at holding individuals accountable through ISP addresses and everything else, and that's one of the things that we kind of look at. And those keyboard warriors are we're trying to hold them more accountable in terms of the aspect of prosecution and stuff like that. So the murder of Muslim students in Chapel Hill was considered a hate crime. Again, I leave that to you because initially you have individuals who are coming from different angles. Some believe it's a hate crime, some believe it's it's one of those things where it's different interpretations. But again, when you look at different individuals, you're looking at the aspect of within a hate crime, what is considered a hate crime. And I think I went through that earlier. And it's one of those things where you're focusing in on initial race or initial ethnicity and utilizing that as your basis for the initial crime itself. Types of victims. In addition to cyberbullying, psychologists have identified four other subtypes of bullying. So you have physical, verbal, social exclusion, spreading rumors. Within that, you have a whole other listing of additional types of bullying. But right now, we're going to focus in on those. Males are more likely to be victims of all types of bullying. Within that, this chapter concentrates on the four types of victims and the effects of victimization on them. So, number one, people who experience adversity and trauma in childhood, targets of sexual harassment, battered spouses, and victims of violent crimes, particularly rape, the crime that has been studied most often. There are two kinds of experiences to consider in the course of human development. Number one, experiences that are emotionally painful and overwhelming for the individual's capacity to cope effectively. Again, you have individuals who go through different hardships, even on the reservation. You have numerous experiences, grief, even the aspects of grief. And I always utilize this as kind of the catalyst because one, and I'll utilize grief within this example. Say, for example, grief itself, from a traditional perspective, initially as the individuals, we were told to initially grieve. We have a 4-day grieving process. And after that, we're supposed to let the individual go who has lost a life. Again, within that, what are the impacts to the child or to a young individual or even for a family member? So again, you have an individual who has been taken from us in terms of life. Again, how does our ability to cope play into that? If there's also the aspect of abuse itself, physical abuse, initially we're primarily told to toughen up. And even within that, you have latchkey kids, kids who initially are being neglected based upon the fact that they're initially having to, or their parents have to, say, for example, work. Therefore, the child is now having to come home to an empty home, or initially even just the capacity of sexual abuse. Even when I used to work as a counselor, one of the things that I came across was the implementation of sexual abuse on the reservation, how rampant it was. But again, one of the things is because of and also because of the different traditional elements that we hold true to ourselves. Sometimes even the aspect of prosecution is limited because again, word is most of, and we'll go into that with sexual abuse. We'll talk about the aspects of a lot of times the perpetrator is somebody that we know, and it's that fear factor. Because if we do know the perpetrator, a lot of times it limits our ability to initially go forward with prosecution because, again, family members, how often are they going to believe the fact that so and so from down the road is actually an abuser? Because a lot of times we're taught that one, stranger danger. But as we begin to learn more and more about it, a lot of times the perpetrator is somebody that is within the family. And sometimes it's not only just a relative, sometimes it's even a parent. And within that, that's one of the things you have individuals, you have children who are saying, yeah, this is what happened. But many times we have parents who are of the other spectrum of saying, no, I don't think that would actually happen. Because if you remember in the last chapter, we're talking about eyewitness testimonies and eyewitness accounts. Now we look at the aspect of believing the individual, believing the victim. And if that is the case, initially we're trying to initially override the element of eyewitness accounts. Now we're saying simply, yes, I do believe you and I am going to believe you. Because the understanding is, why would somebody come up with an initial account like this if it was not as traumatic as they indicated? If that makes sense. So within that, you have individuals who are now sharing their experiences, and within that, we're now looking at it from the aspect of what is actually happening. And then you have number 2, chronic adversity. One of the things we look at is poverty and racism. But on the reservation, we also have rampant generational trauma. And so within that, you have individuals who are in other words, historical trauma, which then impacts an individual and their ability to cope and their ability to move onwards. But one of the biggest things we also look at is the aspect of resilience. So initially at the end, we'll talk about resilience and also the resilient factor. But initially within this, we're looking at initial adversity and trauma in childhood. In addition, we have the relationship between traumatic childhood experiences and physical and emotional health outcomes in adult life is at the core of the ACE study. Say, for example, if you saw your mom or dad being handcuffed and being hauled away because of spousal abuse or because of all these different factors, or even neglect, again, what's going to happen to the child is they're initially going to interpret all of these different factors, and they're also going to become very fearful. When I used to work on the reservation as a coordinator within the area of domestic violence, one of the things I came across was children who initially looked at the police or the initial popo as the bad guy. They initially looked at it as, again, these were homes where alcoholism and abuse was very rampant. But for the child, it became such a learned behavior to the point where they didn't consider the abuse, they considered the abuse as normal. But they saw the initial abuser being hauled away, and they saw it as an adverse because they initially looked at it as, wow, this police officer is not trying to protect us. He's trying to break up our home, or she's trying to break up our home. And when I used to work as an area of advocacy, a lot of times even me or even my staff at the time we're seen as the bad guy because initially we were looked at. And again, you also see this with social services. A lot of times you're coming into this unique environment trying to get a lot of the children out of that unsafe environment and place them in a much safer environment. But a lot of times the children are not looking at it from that viewpoint. They're simply looking at it as, wow, you're breaking up my home. You're breaking up my community. You're breaking up who I am. And you're taking somebody that I love away. So now the ACE study, 1999, involved the study of people who experience one, recurrent physical and emotional abuse, contact sexual abuse, an alcoholic or drug abuser in the household, an incarcerated household member, a household member who is chronically depressed, mentally ill, institutionalized, or suicidal, a mother who is treated violently, one or no parents. Initially, this goes into the area of emotional or physical neglect. Even within that, when I used to work with as a counselor, one of the biggest things I always asked a lot of the students was, or I asked a lot of the parents, and when I used to do workshops with a lot of the parents, one of the things I always look at was divorce. Divorce is that an initial impact on a child, and I had a lot of parents who were like, no, that wouldn't really impact a child. But when I used to work with students and kids, one of the things is when we would go through, say, for example, they were lashing out in classrooms or they were lashing out against their own peers, when we kind of delve into it, a lot of times they'll recount the fact that, yeah, mom or dad, they're now dating somebody new and it's not their original mom and dad, and they're now dating some new individual and they're bringing them home, and I don't know who this person is. And now for that child, they're looking at it from the angle of, I'm having to now adjust to a new person in our home. And again, those are all the uniquenesses. So whenever I talk to parents about, entering into a new relationship, I always talk about having those talks with even your child, the possibility of what's going to happen next. Because a lot of children, again, they're very resilient, that's true. But again, they also have a breaking point. Because a lot of parents simply look at it from the angle of, oh, they're resilient, they'll bounce back. And that's great. Yes, they can, if they have the quality coping mechanisms. But if they're not having any of that, again, it can impact them later on, not only just now, but also later on in life. Now, the ACE study has two major findings. One, adverse childhood experiences are much more common than anticipated or recognized. Number two, adverse childhood experiences have a strong relationship with health outcomes later on in life. Say, for example, their coping mechanisms are not there, which then leads to hypertension, which then leads to higher levels of heart disease, diabetes, and all these different factors. A while back, I used to talk about the impacts of diabetes. One of the things is, even with diabetics, a lot of young individuals, what they were doing was, if you notice that a lot of times they'll eat a lot of sweets, and if they're coming from a more of a poverty-stricken environment, a lot of times a lot of the children will eat a lot of sweets. Why? Because it's readily available. It's a lot cheaper. Number two, initially they're having to scarf on that. Initially, they're having to eat a lot of that because, one, they don't know when the next time they're going to have sweets. So initially they have this high factor of having to eat a lot of that prior to actually eating the healthier foods. Again, which then leads to the aspect of diabetes. And so all these different factors are playing into it in terms of how adverse childhood can impact them later on in life. So now the cycle of abuse. So within that, it was found that abused or neglected children were significantly more likely than a comparison group to have been arrested for violent crimes as juveniles or as adults. Again, a lot of these children are coming from very unique homes, and I always talk about that with a lot of my students. And I always ask a lot of my students prior to them going into the field or going out into, and I always ask a lot of times when I train law enforcement officers that have never seen trauma, that have never seen trauma in terms of what is available in the community. One of the biggest things I always ask is, have you experienced this, and are you ready for that? Are you going to brace yourself for that? Because initially, that's all we can do is brace you for the initial field placement when you work out into the community. And again, this goes in all different directions. But one of the biggest things is my experience, and that's all I can go off of is my experiences. So within that, when I used to train a lot of students, one of the biggest things I always look at is the possibility that you'll be going into homes or even into neighborhoods or even into locations that are not, in other words, very positive. And that's one of the things you're always coming across is the element that a lot of times you're working in neighborhoods or in homes or in locations that are not in the best locations, or sometimes there's a lot of abuse, there's a lot of alcoholism within the home, and being ready for that, preparing your mindset for that, because again, you're coming in a unique state, because you have all this knowledge, you have all this education, you have all this theoretical outlooks, but now you're applying it within the field. And sometimes, and I always tell my students that sometimes you have such great ideas and you're trying to tell a person about all these great ideas, but that person's looking at you as the bad person. As to be ready for that element that they may even refuse help. And that's one of the biggest things is you're coming in at a very unique time in their lives that at times they don't necessarily feel like they need help yet. But again, one of the things you're trying to offer is that, or pretty much trying to proffer, is that element that I am a resource. I am here to help you. I am here to provide as much care as I possibly can. So now, violence, crimes, and PTSD. Recently, many have acknowledged the need to recognize and serve crime victims. For example, since the late 1970s, an interdisciplinary field of victimology has emerged, and that's what I was primarily talking about at the beginning of the PowerPoint. Again, there's increasing availability of services to crime victims, including compensation. So you have VAWA and also VAFA, so Violence Against Women's Act, and you have the Violence Against Families Act. Again, one of the things you're also looking at is the aspect that there are additional resources to help individuals in traumatic situations. And within that, there's a heightened focus on victims brought about by new journals. So within that, you have here infants and toddlers supporting children who have faced trauma. 0 to 2-year-old can't understand that trauma is happening, but they know when their caregiver is upset. Again, within that, you have a lot of young children who are simply looking at it in terms of, wow, if something's happening to the person that's taking care of me, there is something going on, and that's where they start to recognize that. 3 to 5-year-olds, on the other hand, can begin to understand the effects of trauma. They may have trouble adjusting to change and loss. One of the biggest things when I used to work with DV, when you used to transport victims to shelters, a lot of times they come with their kids, and a lot of times the kids don't even know what's going on. A lot of times the child is freaking out. A lot of times the child is, having all these different emotions, and a lot of times even for the victim has not necessarily gone over what is happening, because again, a lot of times the victim is also experiencing all these different emotions as well. And so one of the biggest things I try to do is always have a reset for a lot of the families that are going to shelters. One is just simply explaining the process, breaking it down for the child and simply what's happening around them, and also ensuring that that child has a voice, ensuring that child is also heard. Because a lot of times, a lot of the children are simply looked at it as, yeah, you know what, they don't know what's going on. They don't need to know what's going on. We're just simply trying to get them out of the situation, and that's great. But the reality is, you also want to try to make sure that they are also being heard. The emotions that they're having, the psychological impacts that's happening. That's primarily where you're always looking at those features. Now, individuals who suffer in a severe trauma and later experience intense fear-related reactions when reminded of the trauma may initially be experiencing PTSD. Again, you're looking at PTSD in terms of trauma. Again, it must involve a threat of serious injury or even death, even the perceived threat. So if you look at your DSM, or if you have a DSM, you can look at that for the PTSD listing. And even when it comes down to a perceived threat, before it was only just simply it must involve a threat or a serious injury. But again, even the perceived threat, you're looking at the possibility of there being an initial trauma or even the possibility of an injury or a death can bring about that aspect of PTSD. Re-experiencing the trauma, you have negative thoughts, hyperarousal, hypervigilance, vigilance. In addition to that, you also have avoidance. In other words, the aspect, if you look back on Chapter 5, you're looking at repression. You're looking at all these different factors as well. So the symptoms of PTSD fall into three categories. One is the frequent re-experiencing of the event, in other words, flashbacks or even nightmares. Two, the persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma. Initially, the numbing or dissociation. Number three is the increased physiological arousal, resulting in exaggerated startle response or even difficulty sleeping. So now you're looking at an individual, you have all these different emotions going on, and primarily you have these inner demons primarily coming out at different times, which initially are impacting your ability to function. So how common is PTSD? One, lifetime prevalence of PTSD among adult Americans was estimated to be 6.8%, with 3.6% prevalence for men and 9.7% for women. Again, PTSD is more commonly experienced in military veterans than by those and the general population. One, because they've seen combat and they've experienced combat, and so within that, there's a high prevalence. In addition to that, you also have the aspect of coping. You have individuals who have good coping mechanisms, and again, that's what you're always looking at is the aspect of coping. If an individual has healthy coping mechanisms, they're able to respond pretty positively to the initial trauma. But again, it's one of those things where if they have poor coping mechanisms, again, it could lead to hyperarousal, hypervigilance. So who is more likely to develop PTSD? Again, you have military personnel. There's a high risk factor for PTSD. Again, you're also looking at the extent of injury during trauma. If it's prolonged, initially looking at the aspect of what is happening. Again, that can also develop into the area of complex trauma as well. The belief that the victim's life is in danger and that he or she has no control over the trauma increases risk for PTSD. Again, it's a perceived aspect as well. So again, if you feel like, hey, yes, I am in danger and I feel like I'm in danger, again, that can lead to an element of developing PTSD. Note that although many persons who experience severe trauma may develop acute stress disorders, in other words, trauma-related symptoms that last less than 1 month, most do not go on to develop PTSD. One reason may be that those experiencing trauma, but not PTSD, tend to receive high levels of social support immediately following the event. One of the biggest factors I'm always looking at is resilience. And if you have a support system around you, a healthy support system. Again, I have individuals who come from different backgrounds, and they simply say, "Yeah, I have a support system, but it's not a healthy support system." Again, that can exacerbate that level of PTSD. But if they have a good, healthy support system, they're able to fall back on that social support system, and they're able to move forward. So those who develop PTSD often perceive the world as a dangerous place to which they must retreat, and which then goes into the area of learned helplessness. So initially they feel like, yes, I'm going to retreat into this, therefore I feel like this is the only way I can deal with the stressors. Foe et al. 1995 had developed a course designed to attack these misconceptions in women who have been raped or so initially within the course, the education about common psychological reactions to assault initially looks at the victim to see the responses are normal. Training in skills such as relaxation, meditation, stuff like that. Emotionally reliving the trauma to allow victims to diffuse their fears of the trauma. Initially, almost that level of exposure therapy. So within a safe setting, they're able to relive the trauma. They're able to express all the traumas, initially diffusing that fear of the initial trauma, as well as cognitive restructuring to help women replace negative beliefs about their competence and adequacy. Now, victims who had completed FOA's prevention course had fewer PTSD symptoms than control subjects who had not received treatment. 2 months after the trauma, 70% of the untreated women, but only 10% of the treated women met the criteria for PTSD. So VAFA, so here it is under navigation. So now, initially you're looking at To provide, so the purpose is to provide for safety and protection of family members from violence, to recognize that family violence is contrary to traditional Navajo way of life and is a violation of fundamental human rights, primarily to utilize the criminal justice system to impose consequences upon individuals for behaviors that violate traditional Navajo values such as K'e and Hojo, and to require the criminal justice system to respond to family members with fairness, compassion, and in a prompt and effective manner. When I used to work with victims, a lot of times they look at VAFA and VAWA and even the protection orders, um, so temporary protection orders, initially as a piece of paper. And again, one of the biggest things that I can look at is the element that one, it may seem like a piece of paper, but initially you're creating a paper trail so as to initially fall back upon as you're moving forward with prosecution against the perpetrator. So initially restraining orders. So a restraining order initially is that element regarding domestic violence. So prevalence rates, estimates suggest that 33% of men and 25% of women have been involved in a physically aggressive altercation. So primarily prior to this, a lot of times they would utilize the element fighting, the term fighting. My mom and dad are fighting. Again, with fighting, you're looking at two equally matched individuals creating an initial sparring exercise. But one of the biggest things you begin to realize is with abuse, you're not necessarily looking at the area of fighting. You're primarily looking at the area of one individual trying to overcome another individual through the use of power and control. Again, although in relationships, female to male aggression is as frequent as male to female aggression, male aggression is significantly more likely to result in serious injury. That's where a lot of times the physical altercation primarily comes in. About 30% of all women murdered in the U.S. each year are killed by their male partners. So now, Fullingstead identified the following myths against in regards to battered spouses. So initially, the first one is the battered women are masochists. Number two, they provoke the assaults inflicted on them. Number three, they get the treatment they deserve. Number four, they are free to leave these violent relationships anytime they want to. And lastly, violence among intimate partners is not common. So, first one, beliefs about domestic violence. A survey regarding attitudes and beliefs shows that most respondents think of domestic violence as stemming from individual issues, relationships, and families, but not from the nature of our society. Not many think that women cause their own abuse, but about 25% believe that some women want to be abused, and most believe that women can end abusive relationships. So now looking at men. Men who are nonviolent in their dealings with outsiders behave the same way in their dealings with their intimates. Middle and upper class men don't batter, and middle and upper class women don't get beaten. Within that, you have the battering as a lower class ethnic minority phenomenon, and such women don't mind because this is a part of their culture. And lastly, good battered women are passive and never try to defend themselves. Again, these are myths. That's one of the things that initially individuals hold on to. When you look at battering, batters are more likely than non-batters to be unemployed, be less well educated, be members of minority groups, be of lower socioeconomic status, and have suffered physical abuse as children or saw an abusive relationship between their parents. Initially, that's one of the things we also saw within the implementation, or not implementation, but even the beginning of COVID. Even within this whole pandemic, a lot of times you also saw uniquenesses. You saw a spike in domestic violence cases. Even within the local shelters that I communicate with on the Navajo Nation, a lot of their shelters were they were still getting calls due to domestic violence. They were still getting calls for support for victims of DV, and so within that, one of the biggest things is you have individuals who are staying at home more, and they're now around their spouse more, which then leads to the aspect of higher elements of abuse. And so within that, that's one of the biggest things that can be noted within this pandemic as well. And so when you look at abuse, you're also looking at the elements of, is communication even a possibility? because again, most individuals within a healthy relationship communicate, but again, within abusive relationships, a lot of times the aspects of communication is not present. Therefore, it leads to greater levels of utilizing physical abuse as a means to getting a point across. So now, adolescents who later become batterers have experienced a higher rate of conduct problems and are more likely to have engaged in early substance abuse, have early experiences with coercive or aggressive behavior that may set the stage for similar strategies in adult life. So this can also be seen within dating relationships within high school or even within elementary school. A lot of times you have individuals lashing out. Why? Because initially this is what they've learned. They've learned these similar strategies at home or even just observing it on a daily basis. Therefore, as they were growing up, they initially simply see it as, well, this is how mom or dad got their point across. They were utilizing coercion, they were utilizing abuse, they were utilizing all these different elements to get their point made. Therefore, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Why? Because in my perception, it worked. In my viewpoint, it worked. And so within that, they initially start implementing that. So even when they find relationships, again, they get caught up into that cycle, and that's where it pretty much takes off again. And so then you have individuals kind of carrying on that initial lineage of abuse. So now batterers usually have poor self-concepts. Again, they're not good problem solvers, often have limited verbal skills, are prone to extreme jealousy, thus they monitor their partner's activities closely and exert excessive control over their partner's whereabouts. One of the examples I can utilize is there was an individual, what they had done is they were a mechanic. So one of the things is in order to monitor, so if you ever remember those little apps that you can download on your cell phone to monitor where your kids are. So initially what this individual did, who was a mechanic, they had bought a phone and they had installed it in their spouse's car. And one of the things is the individual put it on silent. And so the abuser, what they would do is they would just leave the phone on all day. And so initially to follow up where the victim was, the abuser would initially call the cell phone. Again, mind you, it was hidden in the vehicle itself. So the abuser would call that cell phone and monitor it through a laptop and initially find where the victim was. And if, say, for example, the victim was going where to a location, say, for example, to a shelter or to another location, the abuser automatically would know where the victim was. And that was their way of isolation. That was their way of intimidation. That was their way of indicating you're not necessarily out of my sight. And it wasn't until the victim was taking the vehicle in for a tune-up that the mechanic that initially the victim had taken the vehicle to another mechanic, and the mechanic had indicated, yeah, I'm doing a preliminary overview of your vehicle, of your chitty, and within that, the mechanic had found the cell phone, and that's where they noted it to the victim, and that's how the victim found out that initially they were being monitored excessively. And so within that, that's one of the big uniquenesses of how far perpetrators will go to monitor their spouse. In addition to that, they initially overreact to signs of rejection and alternate between rage and desperation. So that's where you have an individual, and you see that a lot I used to see it a lot on the reservation, or when I used to work in the field. And I see this also in the cities as well when I used to work there. You have individuals who initially go from rage to desperation. Initially, you have victims always saying, my significant other, they never cry, but this time they cried, and it was so sad because I didn't want to see them cry. And that's the reason why I went back to them. And that's where you have that desperation from the abuser. Or sometimes they go into a rage and simply say, if you don't do this, then this is what I'm going to do to you or even to our children. And so initially that's where they have that aspect of overreaction. So Waltz et al. Reveal three distinct types of batterers. So initially, the first one is generally violent. Second one is the psychopathological individual, and the family only. These three groups were distinguished by the degree of violence within the relationship and the degree of general violence reported, as well as personality characteristics. So initially, this is kind of going to break into the cycle of violence. So we're going to look at that right now. So you have the tension building phase. So initially, this is where an individual is starting to shoot straight up, indicating all the different criticisms, all the different aspects of minor physical assaults. And so this is the tension building phase. And then you have the acute battering incident. Initially, the individual has become too dependent on the spouse to break off the relationship easily. Initially, that's where you go into the area of learned helplessness, and there's that dependency there. And even on the reservation, you start to see that. You start to see that for individuals who have had to go and move into their in-laws. That aspect of support is not necessarily there, but the perpetrator may know that, and the perpetrator may enjoy the fact, or not necessarily enjoy, but they may look at it from the angle of you have nowhere else to go, and I'm your only sole means of support. Therefore, you can't leave me. Therefore, you're going to have to rely on me. Again, this goes even so far as an individual holding on to WIC cards, EBT cards, TANF, all these different things, even so far as stealing the individual's ID, stealing the individual's driver's license, stealing the individual's debit cards or credit cards. And I've even come across cases where the individual will hold the EBT cards and say, you're going to have to come back to me, because initially, if you don't, I'm going to call social services to indicate that you're abusing the child. And therefore, the individual may end up just having to go back because, one, breaking off the relationship is not as easily done as most individuals will initially portray. And number three, a contrite phase. The batterer apologizes for his attacks, promises never to do it again, and persuades the woman that he is a changed person. So again, you have the honeymoon phase, and I always call it the honeymoon phase, where the individual will go back, and that's where you have the terminology thrown around of babe, my love, and all this and that. And again, you have individuals who, and I can always recount that, various cases like that, where they're initially wanting to leave, and suddenly they'll get a phone call by the abuser, and simply in that brief phone call, the individual may say, I'm a changed person, I will never hurt you again. And the patterning, what's going to happen. But again, it's that aspect of that cycle. Initially, the individual just gets caught in that initial cycle on both sides, for the male and the female. And this also goes into homosexual relationships or gender and sexual minority relationships. So again, this goes into that whole aspect of the abuser. And it's primarily the power and control feature, which is provided by the Duluth model. So if you go back 2 chapters ago, I kind of primarily expound on the fact of the Duluth model and kind of looks at the power and control aspects. So now Walker identified the cycle of violence in about 2/3 of the 400 women she studied. Again, you have this whole linear effect kind of passed down through generation to generation. Within that, as many as 40% of batterers have the feature of BPD, severe disturbance that is characterized by unstable moods and behaviors. Now, responses to victims of battering. Again, most individuals have a deep uneasiness, even hostility, therefore exist towards some victims of battering. So this is the abuser. When women kill their batterers, they may receive a greater punishment than men who commit acts with similar outcomes. Again, it's difficult to assess because the circumstances may be quite different. This is where an individual may go into the area of externalized victimization. So initially, the individual had been abused for so long. After a while, the individual says, you know what, I've had enough of this. I am going to unleash the same level of abuse that my abuser has implemented on me. And within that, the individual may end up getting greater punishment because um, initially trying to fight back against their abuser. So now here's the battered women syndrome, defined as a collection of symptoms and reaction by a woman to a pattern of continued physical and psychological abuse inflicted on her by her mate. So initially you have this whole cycle, unmet needs, unresolved issues, anxiety, insecurity, depression, seeking love as a solution, finding temporary relief, pleasing and appeasing your partner. Partner is controlling and abusive. You are angry, afraid, and or withdrawn. He and or you seek reconciliation. Things get back to normal. Again, it goes through this whole cycle as well. And initially, that's one of the things you're always looking at is the aspect of my partner is going to fulfill all my needs. And then suddenly you find that. But again, you also come across the fact that the person may be an abuser. And again, one of the biggest things we're always looking at is spending a year. I always talk about that when I work with relationships, spending a year to get to know the person. Because even 2 years, because again, you're learning more and more. But most relationships, what happens is that first month or 2 months, suddenly we're throwing around the L word. I love this person. I love them. I love who they are, and they complete me. And within that, we don't know enough about them. But one of the biggest things is sometimes we have uniquenesses in our own selves, and we're trying to fill those voids. But again, it's one of those things where as we're going along, they're seeking that love as a solution. And within that, they may come across an individual. And I always call it like the new car smell. When we get into relationships, we have that new car smell. And within that, you have individuals who, when they enter a new relationship, everything is so new. And they kind of bypass the warning signs. And as they bypass the warning signs, they're overlooking those elements. And again, family members, sometimes they see those warning signs, but a lot of times for us, we tend to overlook them because one, we're so infatuated. But again, as time progresses, we begin to see it play out, and we begin to see more and more. And again, that's one of the things we're always looking at. When I used to work with DV, that was one of the areas where we're always educating on safety planning, and also implementing the aspects of monitoring various behaviors and monitoring different actions and different uniquenesses within a relationship. So the Lenora Walker emphasized the following elements. Again, this is through the battered woman syndrome. Within that, she also looked at learned helplessness. As a result of chronic exposure to repeated battering, the woman develops a sense of learned helplessness. She becomes to believe that there's nothing she can do to escape. Some may consider this almost similar to Stockholm syndrome. But again, within relationships, the uniqueness is the fact that, and that's where I always try to make sure there's that differentiation between domestic violence and also familial violence. Within domestic violence, initially you're finding a spouse or finding a significant other, and you're willingly offering yourself to that other person in the hopes that they're not going to hurt you. Versus familial violence, you're simply looking at the element of you don't necessarily choose your own family. But within this learned helplessness, a lot of times you have victims who simply look at it from the angle of I chose this person, and now I have to live with the consequences that I made. Then you also have that number two, as a result of social isolation and often economic dependence on the batterer, the individual falls more and more under that aspect of domination. And that's where an individual ends up having to become more and more reliant on the initial abuser, even though they don't like the abuse. Initially, they're just having to endure it. One, as a form of survival. Two, just simply to keep everything status quo. I've had victims at times, 50, 60-year-olds that initially finally said, you know what, enough's enough. I've had it. I raised my children, and they're now out of the home, and yet this individual is still abusing me, and enough's enough, and I'm finally leaving. And again, that's one of the things is looking at the element of having that hope to move onwards. So now, number three, as she restricts her outside activities and has less contact with friends or relatives, She grows increasingly fearful of threats and attacks. Again, that's that isolation, limiting interaction, indicating that I should be enough in this relationship. I am your spouse and I should be your only friend. Number four, self-esteem is diminished. The individual may feel guilty and ashamed about what they may see as multiple failures and shortcomings, even just leaving the relationship. The children may even look at it from the angle of, why didn't you leave? And there's also an increasing rage and resentment towards their partner. After a while, the individual may feel like, hey, why didn't I leave? And then afterwards, it just comes to the area of simply just saying, all right, you know what, I'm just going to continue staying because I don't know where else to turn. Now, number five, the woman grows hypervigilant. Again, this is with battered women syndrome. They begin to notice subtle things, reactions by the batterer that the other wouldn't recognize as a signal of upcoming violence. For example, his eyes getting darker. This high sensitivity to danger cues often motivates the individual or the woman to kill their assailant and accounts for their belief that they acted in self-defense. So in other words, this would go into the area of externalized victimization. So now, the majority of battered women charged with murdering their abusive partner are convicted. Research with mock juries has found that participants were more inclined to accept the woman's claim of self-defense when they heard from an expert testifying for the defense. So we're going to begin looking at the psychology of rape, initially looking at the misleading stereotypes about rape itself. So within that, you have a little small snippet right here. Myth: we were drunk, so it wasn't rape. One of the uniquenesses that I faced working with victims of sexual assaults, a lot of times one of the things that you come across is the element that the justification. When I used to work with high schoolers, a lot of times we were always looking at the element of, and when I used to do presentations, I used to go through the aspects of victimology and explain the different nuances. And within that, you also come across students. So within that, when I would kind of give it up to, and I open the floor to a lot of the students in terms of information, initially a Q&A. There were times where I would ask that question of, if a person were to tell you no, and this wasn't even necessarily going to the area of rape itself, but primarily looking at the area of dating. And I would ask the question, how many individuals would be okay with the person telling them, I don't want to date you. And for the other individual to simply just hear that and simply be okay with it. And so I would kind of I would open the floor to a lot of students. And at times there were areas where it would actually bring about unique discussions. And one discussion was an individual where they initially relayed the aspect that if they were rejected, they felt that it was their initial prerogative, it was their initial feature as an individual to convince the other person that they were a viable choice. And so then I proffered another question. I said, what if the person was very adamant about the fact that they did not want to initially date you? And that's when that's when this individual indicated, I would not consider it. I would still continue pressing forward to see if they initially would date me still. And if you notice, it was the element of convincing. I would convince them that I was a viable choice. And again, when you look at that, you're looking at the elements of comfort level. You're looking at the elements of all these different features within the mindset of an individual, where they were looking at it from the angle of, I will not take no. I'm not going to take no as an answer. Again, when you're looking at relationships, you want to make sure that you're respecting the other person, and that's primarily what it came down to, was the aspect of respect, and initially respecting the other person's wishes. But for some individuals, again, it's the element of, even though they said no, I'm going to bypass that. I'm going to continue pressing until I get what I initially want. And so within that, one of the biggest living stereotypes about rape itself is, one, the victim cannot be raped against their will. Again, we're looking at various stereotypes. The second one is reports of rape are often exaggerated or even faked. Again, if you notice, there was the aspect of the Me Too movement, but within that, you also came across uniquenesses within the Me Too movement. A lot of these cases were prior cases, and a lot of times you had individuals asking the question of, well, why? Why are these cases coming out now? In terms of prosecution, it does take time in terms of pressing charges, in terms of all these different elements. In addition to that, as we noted, within excuse me, within the prior slides, we were looking at the aspect of memory retrieval, repressed memories, repressed. And again, one of the uniquenesses is if a person had been raped, what's going to happen is the individual may initially withdraw. They initially may disassociate within the initial element of who they are during or within the actual act itself of being raped. And so within that, they may withdraw. In addition to that, they may also have that shame factor. Because even on the reservation, you have the aspect of, well, this person probably was wanting, this relationship, or this person was initially playing hard to get. And so within that, that's where we have these uniquenesses within our cultural and our societal features. But again, one of the things that you come across is when a person is now indicating, yes, this had happened to me, or this had been done to me. Within that, you're looking at the aspect of believing the initial report. So within that, that's one of the things we always look at is if a person has reported a rape, you're initially believing everything. You're believing what they say. Because again, most individuals are always looking at it from the angle of, well, why are they doing it now? Why are they just trying to hurt someone's reputation? One of the biggest things is, I guess the initial mindset is, why would somebody want to do that in the first place in terms of hurting somebody's initial character and everything else, if it were not true. And that's primarily what initially, and again, you're going to have different debates. You're going to have different outlooks. But again, one of the things you're also looking at is the misleading stereotype itself. So now, initially, some have an ideology that encourages the acceptance of myths about rape. Initially, this ideology embraces the following beliefs: sexual conservatism, adversarial sexual beliefs, acceptance of interpersonal violence, and sex role stereotyping. So, sexual conservatism. So, initially, this indicating that one, sex should only be between a man and woman. Initially, within that, everything should be behind closed doors. And within that, even if there is the possibility of rape, then why do we need to broadcast it? In addition to that, you have the adversarial belief system, sexual beliefs. Initially, you have the picture here. You're having to almost be in combat with another individual. You're having to fight for viability. And as I noted before about the student, initially there was that understanding that one, this is normal. I have to do everything I can to initially be with that person, even if that means one having to go the extra step of going against the initial person's given wishes. And then the acceptance of interpersonal violence. Initially, it's the understanding that, everybody does fight, everybody does have relationship ups and downs. But this is going even farther in terms of the physical, psychological, emotional, and sexual abuse. And it's simply looking at it from the angle of, that's normal. That's a normal relationship. And then you have the sex role stereotyping. So initially, men are the initial aggressors, and female are are the individuals that need to be wooed. And so you have these different unique stereotypings. One of the uniqueness is those more tolerant of rape are more likely to have. So initially, these are individuals who initially hold on to the outlook that rape does happen, and within that, that's normal. And so within that, you have the first portion initially looking at traditional beliefs about gender roles. In addition to that, you have the more adversarial sexual beliefs, as well as the greater needs for power and dominance. And again, you're seeing this with our relationships. You're seeing this with unique relationships. You're seeing this across the board. And even on the reservation, you see this skewed element. Within that, you also have the heightened expression of aggressiveness and anger. And a lot of individuals look at it from that angle of, well, they have to show to me initially that they do care for me. Therefore, that individual does have to be aggressive. Or even from the other angle of, boys will be boys and girls will be girls. And initially coming from those other elements. Again, this goes for both. This goes across the gender spectrum. I can't necessarily say that one initially will be dominant over the other because, again, I during my time working with domestic violence, sexual assaults, you saw this from both spectrums. You saw this with heterosexual couples. You saw this with homosexual couples. You saw this with intersex couples. You're seeing this all across the board. So again, you have the different individuals that initially adopt these distinct outlook in regard to rape itself. Now, the United States has one of the highest rates of forcible rape among the world's industrialized countries, although there has been some decrease in the last decade. And there's uniquenesses, even in regards to reporting. Again, we indicate that there is a decrease in the last decade, but again, we also look at the element of, is the decrease due to greater elements of prosecution? Is the decrease possibly in response to greater education to individuals about looking at the law itself? In addition to that, you're also looking at the element of, is there additional features that go into it? In addition to that, you also look at the element of prosecution. As we know that prosecution is not always favorable in regards to sexual assault cases. The reason why is we're looking at winnability. So initially within that, you have individuals who are in that unique state where they may have gone forward. They may have expressed that, yes, this is what had happened. But in addition to that, even though that had happened, there's an element of shame. In addition to that, you also have the aspect of, nothing's really going to happen anyway. Even if I do go forward, the individual is still going to walk free. And we see that also with cases on the reservation. I saw that a lot when cases on the reservation. There's the fear factor, there's the shame factor, you have the cultural factors, you have the societal pressures, and then you also have the simplistic element of families who are in those relationships, who initially have been raped. Initially, they're just simply looking at it from the element of, well, I'm going to accept that initial outlook because it's all I have. I'm afraid to go forward. I'm afraid to do all these different things. And again, you have all these different societal pressures as well. So, now, facts about rape. Sexual assault and rape are never a victim's fault. So initially within that, according to National Violence Against Women survey in 2000, 17.6% of all women said they had been the victim of rape or attempted rape, and 21.6% of these women said they were younger than 12 years old at the time of their first rape. One of the uniquenesses is if a person had been raped at a younger age, a lot of times the possibility of them getting raped at a later time does happen. Initially within that, you're looking at, so say for example, if it's a younger individual and if they have been sexually assaulted, one of the uniquenesses is there's a skewed element that goes into their perception of sex itself. A lot of times you have individuals who, the initial rapists, or the individual who had committed the rape, a lot of times their behavior goes into the area of grooming. And I think I did talk about grooming for a while, or I did bring it up at one point. And when you look at grooming, you're looking at the elements of an individual who is grooming a younger individual into becoming more accepting of various actions and various behaviors. And initially, the individual is, or the young individual is now capable of carrying out different sex acts, so long as the initial act itself is kept private. Again, that's where the grooming comes in. That's where the grooming aspects come in. So, and again, the grooming, I'll talk about it at a later time. I believe I'll even bring that in terms of sex trafficking, in terms of all these different things, and we'll talk about that at a later time. But one of the uniquenesses is, even from a young age, you have individuals, and I think I did talk about that at one point, A lot of times we educate a lot of our young family members, our young children, about the aspects of stranger danger. But the reality is we forget that a lot of times a lot of the perpetrators are not strangers. A lot of times they're family members. They're people that we know. And within that, the victim, and I think we did talk about it at the beginning of the PowerPoint we were talking about a victim now coming forward in terms of eyewitness accounts. Because one, they do know more about the individual that they are engaging with. But again, you also have the aspect of, and that's where the grooming aspects come in. Because the individual may feel like, hey, I'm going to protect this other individual. I feel conflicted about reporting on this individual that had sexually assaulted me. And there's all these different elements. And again, a lot of times, a lot of individuals who are committing the actual crime initially come from the other angle of, yes, if you tell on me, if you say anything to anybody else, again, I'm going to do this to you, or I'm going to do this to your family. And again, there's also that initial fear. And so again, if that happens at a younger age, now imagine that you're holding on to that and you're trying to repress a lot of those memories, and you do repress it. But as you get into another relationship later on in life, as you get older, those same triggers will come back. And initially, that's one of the things you're always looking at. Now, among rape victims, 31.5% reported being physically injured during their most recent rapes. Or their initial recent rape. Almost 18 million women and almost 3 million men in the United States have been raped. Women who reported being raped as minors were twice as likely to report being raped as adults, and I kind of just went over that earlier. Women of all ages, social classes, and ethnic groups are vulnerable to rape. The high-risk age groups are children and adolescents for most offense, as well as women age 18 to 24. Initially for rape. So again, you're looking at all spectrums. You're looking at young children all the way into adulthood. And again, one of the things, the initial myth was, the reason why I raped that individual is because of what they were wearing. But when you look at the psychology of individuals who are rapists, you're looking at additional factors. You're looking at the power dominance element. You're looking at the aspect of power and control. And not necessarily, it's not about the sex itself, but it's actually about that initial power, that control, that dominance. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So again, according to the National Violence Against Women study, only 90% of the women and 30% of the men who were raped after age 18 said their rape was reported to the police. And the aspect is why, why would that happen? Why is it so, why only a limited amount are initially reporting the rape? Again, most individuals, and we'll talk about that as time progresses. We're looking at date rape. We're looking at acquaintance rape, and you're looking at all these different uniqueness factors. A lot of times, even the person who is the person that is the rapist, a lot of times it's somebody that they know or somebody that they had been in a relationship with, and that's one of the uniquenesses because a lot of times the victim may already know that individual and may have broken up with them, or may have had a relationship at one point, and then at a later time, this individual may have had a trigger. And so initially within that, they initially carry out the act and everything else, or may have already been thinking about it and initially carried out the act itself. And therefore, the victim may feel like, hey, if I do report it, is the police actually going to believe me? Is anybody going to really believe me? Because again, if they had already been intimate with this person, then the other factor is, they may not even believe me because, I was already intimate with them already. So they're simply going to say that the possibility is that it was consensual. So now, why are rape report rates so low? Again, we kind of talk about that. The reporting won't help. They would suffer further embarrassment as a result of reporting. You have a little picture here. It says, I can't say no to my boyfriend. A lot of times you also have marital rapes. A lot of times individuals who are married feel that, one, I'm married, so obviously it can't necessarily be rape, even though I said no. And law enforcement officers would not believe them. Many victims are afraid that the attacker will retaliate if charges are made. And these expectations are sometimes fulfilled. A lot of times even the the victim, even if they report it, where do they have to go back to? A lot of times their own homes. And where does the perpetrator have to go to? Initially, sometimes back to that home, that same home. And so initially, they may initially retaliate. And within that, that's one of the things you're always looking at. So a lot of times the rates are low because initially the victim may feel like, hey, if I do report, then it's gonna come back and it's gonna impact me. It's gonna hurt me. Here you have the case of Bill Cosby, prominence and the accusation of sexual assault, and this kind of just segues into the area of um, predatory behavior. And when you look at predatory behavior, you're looking at the aspect of having dominance. And you have an individual who, even when you look in their past, this was an individual who was highly influential. And so within his life, he's initially, due to his status, due to um, his star power, in other words, he was able to get what he initially wanted. And the same thing actually applied within when you look at the aspects of his predatory behavior in regards to sex, in regards to sexual assaults. Initially, he was drugging individuals, and within that, the accusations did come at a later time because one, and a lot of times, a lot of individuals were indicating that one, this individual, or these individuals are just trying to mar his name, and they're trying to get something out of it. As we noted prior, a lot of times, why would somebody want to do that? Why would somebody want to mar somebody's name? And a lot of times you had individuals coming from the other element, well, they wanted to get famous. There's other ways of getting famous without having to utilize statements. So again, when you take all of those into account, you also look at the aspect of, there is a possibility that there is some truth to it. And so as the case progressed, you begin to see different elements of it. You begin to see different individuals, different accusations coming across. And so as these accusations came across, there was additional validity that also lent itself to that. And so as time progressed, you begin to see different patterning. And within that, you had an individual who felt like, I'm untouchable. I'm untouchable. You also have an individual like I believe it was um, Henry Weinstein, um, who initially also had aspects of predatory behavior. And within that, initially these are individuals who are high profile. So within these individuals, the outlook is that they initially got what they wanted because initially, due to their star power, due to their status, due to all these different elements, they were initially catered to. But within the area of sexual assault or within the area of sex, one, there has to be a level of consent. And within that, even if consent was not given, it was almost the element of, well, I still want sex anyway, and I'm going to get it whatever means I can, even if that means drugging an individual or initially overstepping those initial boundaries. So all these different factors, when you take into account all of this, a lot of it comes down to the area of predatory behavior. Sex Offender Registration and Notification Act of 2012. So this is through the Navajo Nation. So if you ever have a chance, there's a SORNA office over in Chinle. Within that, the focus is on the Navajo Nation in terms of acts to protect the public, particularly children, from sex offenders by requiring the registration of convicted sex offenders who reside, work, or go to school within the Navajo Indian country, and notification to the community of such convicted sex offenders in accordance with this act in Title I of the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act of 2006. So primarily when you look at that, you're looking at the aspects of individuals. You're protecting the individuals. If you go onto the website, there's a website. I'll list it in the next slide, and within that, you can go on and you can look at individuals in regards on the Navajo Nation that initially that has information in regards to the features of registration. And so initially, that's one of the things. Again, it's beneficial, but I also have other individuals who begin to look at it from the area of vigilantism, and one that is also a crime. So you have individuals who feel like, hey, I'm going to utilize these websites and I'm going to utilize these different resources to go after sex offenders. I would encourage you not to do that. One, because it's very dangerous. Two, you're not Batman, so don't do that. But within that, it's primarily a resource. It's a resource just to initially keep you safe, to know your neighbors, to know initially the people around you. And so within that, with the next slide, I'll go over that. So here's the resource. Again, we go in. Again, it's one of those things where there's also a disclaimer on there. One of the biggest things that you're looking at is community notification, as well as geographical search, as well as name search. So I would encourage you to look at it if you have a chance. Again, it's one of those things where it's a resource to you. Initially, you're looking at just being better informed. So Nation Sex Offender Register public information site. One of the big things with, again, it has it labeled there, Nation Sex Offender Registry for public view. So NNSORP is the Nation Public Sex Offender Registry, as required by the Nation Sex Offender Registration and Notification Act. The accuracy of the information is based on the information provided by sex offenders at the time of their registration with the Nation Police. Again, it's one of those things where you're hoping that it is updated regularly. But again, due to COVID and everything else, there's various hiccups. But one of the biggest things is it just helps you to be better informed. That's one of the things I'm always a big advocate for, making sure that you have the best information, make sure you have the most updated information, so as to have you, a learner, to have information that is relevant versus simply just having a bunch of information. Again, you have facts, resources, community notification. So again, it is there. So I would encourage you to look at it. Sexual assault. The reported numbers on the Nation. So again, this one only goes up to 2010. So there's a gap between 2010 and 2020. Again, this was through the Suicide and Substance Abuse Prevention Institute, as well as the National Indian Health Board. This was back in 2016. So again, in 2006, there were 38 rapes within 29, resulting in an arrest. There were 10 attempted rapes. So again, if you have that, if you're looking at the numbers, 338 rapes with only 29 resulting in an arrest. This was back in 2006. The aspect of, when you look at it, the prosecution, you're looking at, the viability going forward with a lot of these cases. Again, you're also looking at winnability. When I used to work with sexual assault cases, a lot of times you're always looking at those features, because you have individuals who at times will recant initially what their statements and everything else. And when that happens, again, a lot of the cases get thrown out. In 2007, there were 328 rapes committed on that reservation, and 17 led to an arrest. There were 6 attempted rapes. If you notice, the numbers are really high, but all of a sudden, when it comes to the arrest, it's very low. You have individuals who also leave the reservation. When they leave the reservation, a lot of times even having to go out there and search for them becomes additional cumbersome aspect, because a lot of the police officers, if you notice, were very limited on police officers even on the reservation itself. And so having to go farther forward and everything else with prosecution, again, a lot of times is somewhat limited. In 2009, 368 incidents of rape, as well as 0 prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney. In 2010, 329 incidents of rape and 7 attempted rapes. So moving forward, unreported sexual assault crimes in American Indian communities may go unreported, or they may be delayed reporting because, one, victims' embarrassment and shame. Again, when you look at the communities, a lot of times you have individuals who simply look at it from the angle of, well, why should we believe them? Why do we need to believe them? Why do we need to believe a victim? That's my uncle, or that's my aunt, or that's my relative, and that's not right. You're bringing shame to our community, for having to report it. This should have been dealt with as a more in closed community element. This should only, why do we need to broadcast this? So again, a lot of times victims feel that embarrassment, and so they're just simply going to say, no, I'm not going to report this. In addition to that, you also have the mistrust or lack of confidence in the system. As you noticed, a lot of times even the arrest is very low. So there's a lack of confidence. There's a lack of confidence in the judicial system. the justice system. A lot of times they're looking at it from the angle of, well, if I do report this to Now Nation Police, the Now Nation Police primarily goes by common law or all these different elements, and it's not really going to go any farther. In addition to that, you also have the fear of retaliation. When I used to work with individuals, there was one incident where there was an aspect of a gang rape, and so within that, the feature of a gang rape falls into the area of, if I do express that I have been raped by multiple individuals, the possibility of me surviving and me getting away is very low. Therefore, I'm just going to keep it quiet. But again, you're also looking at the fear of my own family. And, if I have children, what's going to happen to them? Is social service going to look positively on them as well? Is that going to be something that they will consider? The trauma that has happened to me, or are they simply going to look at it as, okay, we need to get you out of that, and we need to get your children out of that initial home because it's unsafe for everybody, it's unsafe for the children. So you have all these different things that go into it, and you also have family members. When I used to work with various communities, that was one of the biggest things. Is you have family members who initially will start retaliating against the victim. And sometimes it's something as simple as, well, not simple, but something as unique as burning the home of somebody, or shooting up the person's vehicle, and primarily just going higher and higher and higher, and to the point where the individual says, you know what, I've had enough, and then they'll leave. And that's where you have the limited element of reporting, and they'll leave. They'll go to a larger town or a bigger city just to get away from that initial feature of retaliation. And then we always ask the question of, how come a lot of victims always leave the reservation? Well, that is the reason why a lot of times is the fear of retaliation from a family member or from a relative. And so initially that kind of has a compounding factor, which then just builds and builds and builds to the point where the individual feels like, hey, you know what, my only option is just to get out of here. Prosecution of sexual assault or the Navajo Nation. So we had the numbers before. 2006, 7 submittals, 4 guilty, and then 3 still open cases. 2007, 10 submittals, 3 dismissed, 2 guilty, 3 declined, 1 open, and 1 open as duplicate. Then 2008, you have 7 submittals, 2 guilty, 2 declined. 2009, 14 submittals, 2 open, 9 guilty, 2 declined. So these are the numbers submitted by the U.S. Department of Justice. So the prosecution is initially, again, like I indicated, there's a lot of cases that do come forward, and the possibility of winnability. And I always talk about winnability. That always comes into it. Because if you look at it, the aspect of sexual assaults, a lot of times what happens to a victim, if they've been sexually assaulted, you have to take into account the fact that the individual may be in shock. 2, a lot of times before they get a rape kit, a lot of times again, they can do rape kits through IHS and they'll go through a sexual assault nurse, a SANE nurse. And so within that, a lot of times the SANE nurse will advise the victim not to take a shower, not to change their clothes, not to get rid of their clothes, to save the evidence. But if a person had been sexually assaulted, the first thing that you want to do is one, to get everything off, initially to be as disassociated as you can from the initial incident, from the initial memory, from the initial physical evidence. You're just trying to get everything away. And so when that happens, sometimes you have evidence being destroyed. And so all these things happening, these different compounding factors, and a lot of times when it goes forward with prosecution, a lot of times they're asking the aspect of, well, this is what had happened. And so the aspects of saving the evidence is not necessarily there. And so within that, when I do educations on the reservation about sexual assaults, I'm always talking about saving evidence, even if as far as going to saving submittals of texts. So within that, that's one of the things is sometimes you have aspects of that. Sometimes you have individuals who will create initial non-consensual pornography. Initially, they'll create a video of the intimate act itself, and they'll broadcast it. They'll upload it through Pornhub. They'll upload it through YouPorn. They'll upload it through all these different xnxx I believe it's .com, and so you have all these different resources that they'll upload it through, and that would be considered revenge porn. Um, and initially within that, these are areas of actual rape. And by the time the victim finally finds out, initially, that again, one of the biggest things is I always tell a lot of individuals is to save that evidence. Again, it is one of those uniquenesses where you're having to try to advise an individual or advocate for an individual to save the evidence. But again, you also have to take into mindset the victim themselves, because a lot of times they're looking at it from the angle of I don't want to do that. I'm scared. I'm all this. And one of the biggest things I always tell a lot of victims is the reassurance, but also the aspect of making sure that they, even if they don't want to go forward with prosecution, at least if they get if they conduct a rape kit, initially they're able to have that evidence on file, as well as have the initial kit itself. A lot of times it's stored through criminal investigation and everything else, and so as it's stored, as well as through IGS, I believe. Yes, my memory, if my memory is correct, yes. Initially, as it's stored, primarily what you're doing is so if you are going to later on at a different time, you say, for example, you're like, you know what, I know I have been raped and I know I had this happen to me, therefore I'm going to go forward with prosecution. At least you would already have the collected evidence already. And so that's one of the things you're always looking at is the individual may not feel ready now, but at a later time, at least they're able to say, yes, this is initially what had happened to me. The motivation and characteristic of a rapist. Experts have developed typologies of rapists. Most typologies have emphasized four unique factors that distinguish different types of rapists. The very first one is the amount and type of aggression the rapist used. Initially, they're looking at the aggressive factor. How was their aggression? What type of, how much amount, and in other words, what type of aggression was utilized? Was there major force utilized? Then you look at the second one, when the level of aggression was high, whether it high in sexual arousal in a sadistic manner. Number three, whether the offender showed evidence of psychopathy or antisocial personality disorders. And then four is whether the offender relied on deviant sexual fantasies to produce sexual arousal. Now, Ellis identified three theories of rape. So the first one is the feminist theory, second one is the social learning approach, and the third one is the evolutionary theory. So the feminist theory emphasized rape as a pseudosexual act of male domination and exploitation of women. Again, that's primarily one outlet. You have individuals who feel like, yes, this is a male-dominated society, therefore this is the reason why they initially rape is because one, they're trying to exploit women. But on the Navajo Nation, again, you have a different element that also plays into it. Because one, you have two different ideologies going forward. Because one, we are a matrilineal society and a matriarchal society. And then you have individuals who had grown up in a matrilineal and matriarchal society, but also are having to adopt, or not having to, but they initially have already adopted a patrilineal and patriarchal society. And so within that, you have individuals who are possibly trying to vie for dominance as a whole, because initially there's that element of confusion. So number two, you have a social learning approach, suggesting that sexual aggression is learned through observation and imitation. And this is the unique one, because we talked about, I think at one point, um, the aspect of porn use, but you also look at the aspect of pornography. And if you see it, if you look at the aspect and the unique learning aspects of pornography, you have individuals who are restructuring their brain. A lot of times, through prolonged porn use, what happens is you have an individual who is viewing their ability, their tolerance begins to change. So, say for example, they're initially looking at how do you call it, softcore porn, and then it starts to progress into hardcore porn. That's where you have individuals going into the area of sadistic elements. You have individuals who are now going into the area of more aggressive features of sex. And it's to the point where it just becomes so aggressive, and the individual is now building on that. And as they're building on that, it's no longer a fantasy anymore. Now it has to be lived out in real life. So initially you have all those different elements going into it. And then you have number three, the evolutionary theory, holding that natural selection primarily favors men who use force sexually. And again, you're also looking at those elements initially, looking at sexual behavior. Initially, we were looking at the element of, well, this is how it was done before, and this is the reason why. And it worked back then, and now it's going to work now to get what I want. And as I noted, a lot of times you have, when I worked with high schoolers initially, they held this element that, well, this is how my dad or my mom got their mate, is they were really forceful in everything that they do, even when it came down to sex. So therefore, I'm going to do the same elements and I'm going to do the same features to get what I want. Now, these different approaches illustrate that rape cannot be easily explained by any one theory. That's one of the uniquenesses. So not one theory can kind of pinpoint it. But again, each of these classification systems fails to capture all the behavior motivations that typify rapists. Some are limited by the fact that they are based on studies of convicted rapists who have been sentenced to prison. So again, a lot of times you're looking at individuals who had primarily been convicted. So initially you're looking at a very small margin. Initially that fewer than 10% of rapes result in conviction or prison sentence. Again, there's that. Because again, these are individuals who had been caught. But again, you're having a small sample size. And within that sample size, you're trying to figure out what a generalization of overall rape behavior. And again, it's very limited. Only 14.6% of rapes were committed by a stranger to the victim. 16.4% were committed by a non-relative acquaintance, and 6.4% by a relative, and 64% by an intimate partner. So if you notice those numbers, intimate partner, this is a person that the person had already known, or the victim had already known the perpetrator. So within that, the aspects is it was really high. And again, this goes for both individuals, because again, can men get raped? Yes. So that's one of the things you're also having to take into account. As of 2008, the estimates for sexual assault committed by a known individual is about 70%, because a lot of times the individual may have been brushed aside. Maybe this was a family friend, or maybe this was an individual who was a friends with benefits, that had a friends with benefits relationship. And the individual may have moved on and said, you know what, I'm gonna stop this friend with benefits relationship, and I don't want it anymore. And the other person may become enraged by it. In addition to that, this may be an individual who had been rebuffed after a prolonged relationship. So again, this at times this is a person that the victim had already known. Again, the closer the relationship between the female victim and the offender in general, the greater the likelihood that the police would not be told about the assault. Here you have a picture of Spike Your Best Friend's eggnog when they're not looking. When the offender was a current or former husband or boyfriend, about 3/4 of all victimizations were not reported to the police. Again, there's that fear because one, is it going to be believable? Are police actually going to re-victimize me in terms of, are they going to believe what I have told them? Or are they simply going to say, you know what, this is probably just a lover's quarrel and we're not going to get involved? Again, those are one of the things is you have individuals coming from all different angles. So again, date rapes. So acquaintance rape and date rape. Date rapes tend to occur on weekends between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. And they usually take place at the assailant's home. You have individuals who are using hypnol, utilizing different elements. One of the things is date rape tends to involve situations which both the attacker and the victim have been using alcohol or drugs, but they are less likely to involve the use of weapons. Instead, the date rapist employs verbal threats and physical prowess to empower his victim. So initially, you're looking at those different elements. Look at those different features. Again, this also goes into the area of individuals in homosexual relationships as well. When I used to talk to a lot of police officers, that was one of the things that I always talked about. You had individuals who were like, what if we respond to a case where it's a homosexual couple? How do we know who the aggressor is and who isn't? And I said that's where your interviewing comes in, the cognitive interviewing. That's where you're having to look at and gather more information. That's where you're looking at all these different features to make sure that you're not discounting an initial victim and what they're trying to tell you. And so initially, that's one of the things you're always looking at. So initially, you're looking at consequences of being raped. A lot of times, rape victims suffer physical injuries, emotional pain, and humiliation, and sometimes severe psychological after effects. You have individuals who primarily withdraw from even engaging in additional relationships. They'll primarily withdraw within the area of intimacy as time progresses, because initially they're always looking at those factors. Sometimes they have additional adverse effects. So again, that's one of the things you're always looking at. Consequences of being raped. Burgess and Holstrom, 1974 1979, described a rape trauma syndrome. And this was experienced by victims through different initial reactions. Initially, changes in lifestyle. Initially, the way of life has changed. Initially, they'll change it. Hanging out with friends, they'll become more withdrawn, or they'll go the opposite as well. They'll become more. They'll search for. They'll try to fill that initial emotional void, and then disturbances in functioning, and so their ability to cope and their ability to move on within their daily life has been altered due to the initial rape, and a lot of times their ability to function in everyday life is initially stunted. Emotional responses initially, their emotionality, their ability to initially seek out new relationships and also to seek out support is limited, because initially they're looking at it as that element of self-blame. And so that's one of the things you begin to look at in terms of the reactionary process. Then a secondary crisis occurs, in which some of the symptoms of the acute crisis phase, particularly phobias and disturbances in eating and sleeping, initially return. This phase may last for hours or days. Initially considered the quiet period, in which a victim feels a range of negative emotions. In other words, they become more withdrawn. There's that sense of loneliness, anger, and guilt. And so within that, how do women react to being raped? So again, that's one of the things you're looking at, the elements of those. How do women react to being raped? A lot of times there's the long-term counseling for rape victims. Again, one of the things is providing counseling at times is difficult due to the fact that at times staffing is somewhat limited, and in some cases feeling that counseling is no longer needed. A lot of times it's the element of, you know what, I've been going to counseling, I've been going here and there, and maybe the counselor just doesn't understand what I'm going through. Or they may feel like, this is not worth it. And that's where the initial crisis phase kind of comes back again, where you have an individual simply relapsing into the area of one, is my life even worth it in terms of what I want to get out of relationships? I enjoyed relationships, I enjoyed intimacy, but now suddenly after the rape, I'm very fearful. I'm fearful for my life. I'm fearful of all these different things. I'm fearful that it may happen again. And so within that, the counseling, they may feel like going to counseling is not even beneficial. Within that, you have different forms of counseling, and you're having to try to blend the various therapeutic elements to make sure that you're catering to the initial victim, because one, you want to make sure that the individual is being helped versus simply just re-victimizing the victim. You don't want to initially do that. Even after a year, many victims continue to suffer emotionally. There's an additional aspect of fear and anxiety, because initially when you look at the aspects and the features of a rape victim, their initial world has in essence both crumbled and has been put into disarray. So within that, findings also indicate that rape victims were significantly more depressed than those who had not been raped, and that fear and anxiety and depression were highest in women who had been raped more than once. So if a person had been raped more than once, an individual may initially look at that and say, okay, what is happening? For the individual, they may become more withdrawn. And And so when that happens, you have an individual who simply is wondering themselves, saying, am I the cause of this? Am I the cause of all these different rapes? Is there something wrong with me? And that's where you have the fear, then you have the anxiety, the fear of it happening again, and the fear of, is this a possibility? And then the depression, initially feeling lower than anything else. So initially, you're simply looking at your life and saying, okay, this had happened to me. Maybe this is always going to happen to me. Therefore, why should I put any effort into relationships as a whole? Therefore, I'm just going to simply fall farther and farther and farther into my depression. And initially, that's one of the things you're always looking at is the impacts. So now, psychologists, along with psychiatrists and other physicians, often testify as expert witnesses in rape trials, primarily about the consequences and nature of rape trauma syndromes. Um, Again, courts around the country are divided on the admissibility of such testimony because, again, you're always looking at winnability in a case. And within these cases, if eyewitness testimony is not reliable, if all these different features are not reliable, you're looking at the aspect of, well, what about rape trauma? And is that applicable? Because you're looking at the science as well. You're looking at and saying, okay, this is what we've seen with victims. And within that, you're looking at the element of support. So two basic strategies have been emphasized. One is training. Two is designing effective treatment for rapists. So the training, primarily, you're always looking at self-defense. Women who did not resist a rape attack were twice as likely to suffer a completed rape as women who tried to protect themselves. Again, you have different self-defense techniques. I used to always teach what is called SPUR, stun, push, run. And within that, you stun the individual, you push, and then you run. And that's one of the things that I always looked at in terms of prevention. In addition to that, one of the uniquenesses has been the fact that at times we begin to create adversarial relationships. And that's primarily what I'm not trying to encourage. What I try to encourage is primarily the area of awareness, whether it's with a partner or whether it's just in your everyday life. But within that, you also look at the designing of effective treatment for rapists so that their initial crimes do not repeat itself. So you have aspects of chemical castration. So in a typical rape prevention program, participants discuss several rapes or several facts and myths about rape. In addition, they learn how to avoid situations involving heavy use of alcohol or any type of drug that may initially diminish their capacity to get away. Practice resisting pressure for unwanted sexual activity. And role play, other strategies for protecting themselves. Again, you're looking at all these different factors. Again, if you notice in the picture, it's you have an individual fending off their attacker. In the background, you also have a male individual. Again, like I said, a lot of times you're looking at all different walks of life. You're looking at all gender as well. Because one, again, rape can happen to anybody. But within that, you're just trying to make sure that you have that preventative measure. In some states, men convicted of sex crimes are required to complete a sex offender treatment program before being considered for parole. Within that, one aspect has been the utilization of chemical castration. So in 1997, chemical castration had been adopted. Initially, you're looking at drugs which suppress testosterone production, as well as female hormones and drugs for treating prostate cancer, such as Leukerin are injected. Depletion of male hormones in the testes shuts down sex drive. But the uniqueness with this is the effectiveness is primarily unclear. Sex criminals go through medical evaluation by doctors, medical experts request orders for chemical treatment, interviews conducted for psychiatric and physiological assessment, and then court issues chemical castration up to 15 years. So that's primarily what you're looking at. So in the United States, it is not uncommon for anti-androgen drugs to be prescribed to sex offenders in order to reduce their sex drive. But as noted, primarily this is known as chemical castration. But the uniqueness is The issue has been the negative side effects. The rate of men dropping out of such treatment programs is relatively high. So initially, you have individuals, um, and you have a picture there, which primarily is an individual who feels like, yes, no, I don't want an individual who is a rapist to live, because primarily the possibility of ruining somebody's life, and ruining their overall um, longevity in terms of positivity is now stunted. And so that's one of the things you always designing effective treatments for rapists. The treatment does not always reduce sexual arousal and sexual offenses. That's primarily what the uniqueness has been. Um, so it does not reduce sexual arousal and sexual offenses. And some men, arousal is not dependent on their level of testosterone. So the drugs have little effect on their sexual behavior. So even though they're getting this chemical castration, it doesn't necessarily, their arousal is not dependent on their level of testosterone. Rape is often an act of violence, not of inappropriate sexual arousal. Consequently, drugs aimed at reducing sexual desire may be pointing at the wrong direction. So, as noted, it's one of those things where, even though they're limiting testosterone, the reality is that may not be what the initial rapist is going off of. Another approach to treating aggressive sexual offenders involve combining several behavior therapy techniques into an integrated treatment package. So this is Time Magazine. Can bad men change? Within that, this is one of those uniquenesses, because one, you want to make sure that the treatment protocol that you're utilizing is effective. Because if you're going to have an individual go back into society who had been a rapist, you want to make sure that the treatment is effective so as they don't carry out their initial modus operandi. And so that's one of the things you want to make sure of. You want to make sure that they're not falling back into that initial trap again of their previous criminal behavior. So existing programs appear to be able to produce short-term decreases in recidivism, but long-term improvements have been difficult to achieve. As a result, relapse prevention techniques have been added to some programs. So relapse prevention, again, it may happen again, but at least they're trying to prevent it from happening overall. So here's Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who initially was nicknamed the Great Seducer. One of the things is while visiting a New York City hotel, he surprised a maid and forced her into oral and anal sex. Within that, you have the individual there. But the uniqueness is, um, although he is renowned for his philandering, the credibility of the individual who indicated that they had been assaulted was also put into a question, because one, she recanted her testimony, and due to the fact that the case was dropped because of the history of both parties. And that's one of the things is you're always looking at those elements. So now prevalence rates. So now we're going to look at sexual harassment. So first we were looking at sexual assaults. Now we're looking at sexual harassments. This would be in the workplace or in your everyday feature. So sexual harassment. What is sexual harassment? When I used to work with various workplace entities, we used to always go through different elements of various trainings regarding sexual harassment, so as to create a positive working environment and a safe working environment. And one of the uniquenesses on the reservation or on the Navajo Nation has been the element of joking. A lot of people always look at it as, well, this is just a joke. Why would it be considered sexual harassment? And again, it's one of those things where it's unwanted, and we'll talk about it in a bit. Hold on. For example, a study examined sexual harassment in academic medicine found that about half of female faculty experience sexual harassment. Both men and women experience sexual harassment. Both report that other men sexually harass them as well. The U.S. federal law defines harassment as follows: unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature constitute sexual harassment when, one, submission to such conduct is made either explicitly or implicitly as a term or condition of an individual's employment. So this would be an individual indicating, if you want to keep your job, then initially I want such and such. If you want to keep getting paid, initially this is what I would want. Or initially sending emails or sending sexual innuendos. And that's one of the things is so long as the condition is your employment. Number two, submission to or rejection of such conduct by an individual is used as the basis for employment decisions affecting such individual. Initially, say for example, you reject the individual and they simply say, okay, well, you rejected me, therefore I am going to fire you. You did not give in to my advances, therefore, this is what's going to happen. And then such conduct has the purpose of or effect of unreasonably interfering with an individual's work performance or creating an intimidating or hostile or offensive working environment. Again, as you notice, it goes between all gender spectrums. Again, that's one of the things I try to make sure that's clear, because again, sexual harassment has no boundaries, and that's one of the things I'm always trying to create is boundaries. And that's one of the things I always look at. But as we go forward, one of the uniquenesses is the aspect that with harassment, you're looking at an individual who is having unwanted advances. And because this such and such had not initially relinquished those advances, excuse me, the individual may feel like, hey, you know what, I'm going to get back at them. And I'm going to utilize this, this, and this to get back at them. So now, one problem with the federal definition of sexual harassment is that it leaves key terms such as unwelcome and unreasonably interfering open to varying interpretations. If you notice that the federal government primarily has different definitions, and within that it kind of leaves it open to interpretation. And that's one of the positives and also one of the dangers. When men and women differ in their evaluation of potentially harassing interactions, women are more likely than men to classify a specific act as harassment. So within that, you have a little portion there, sexual harassment in the workplace, offering benefits for sexual behavior or sexual favor, unwanted sexual advancements, threats or retaliation to no, visual conduct, in other words, suggestive gestures, verbal contact, in other words, or verbal conduct, in other words, derogatory comments, physical conduct, body positioning, or touching. Again, all these things play in. And then I had a while back, I had an individual ask, what about flirting? Would that be considered sexual harassment? And I said, well, it's a very slippery slope in terms of the workplace. And within that, I always err on the side of caution and indicate primarily just look at your workplace as a professional sphere. And primarily always look at it from that angle because one, you are initially there to perform an initial service in terms of the job placement that you're doing. And if you mix in the area of sex itself, or even the aspect of the features regarding intimacy, again, it could go into a bad news bears kind of outlook. So now within that, hostile sexism involves antipathy towards women. In other words, reflecting a belief that males are superior to women and should be dominant over them. Those high in hostile sexism are less inclined to conclude that sexual harassment had occurred. Then you have benevolent sexism. It's an attitude of protection towards women. It reflects belief that as a weaker sex, women need to be shielded from the world's harshness. So again, you have two different viewpoints. One is hostile, one is benevolent. Courts, following federal guidelines, have recognized two types of sexual harassment. So quid pro quo and hostile workplace harassment. So quid pro quo is seen in terms of implicit or explicit bargaining, in which the harasser promises reward or threatens punishment. In other words, you do something for me, and are within that, I will initially reward you. You do something for me, then initially you'll get that raise, or you do something for me, initially you get that promotion. And primarily it's dependent on the victim's response. For the hostile workplace environment, it involves demeaning comments, acts of touching or attempted intimacy, or the display of provocative photograph or artwork. So that's one of the things is if it's outside of the initial means of what is intended. Because I had individuals also ask, well, the trainings, are they considered harassment as well? Because we're seeing images of this, this, and this. And I said, well, no, because initially the aspect is on teaching. So initially we're teaching different elements of that, of the possibilities of the different dangers. So again, as noted, it's one of those things where it can also be very subjective. A lot of the sexual harassment aspects can also be very subjective. So initially that's one of the things is you're going based on the individual that had been harassed. And so you're going off of their initial testimony. So now with sexual harassment, so Teresa Harris was a rental manager of a forklift system in Nashville. So primarily it revolved around her boss. Her boss initially would make suggestive and demeaning comments. Again, within that, she ignored him for 2 years. And primarily within, he made a public sexual accusation. So within that, she took her case to court, and within that, she did get mixed results. So the lower courts saw that one, there was no psychological harm initially present. Therefore, she had to go farther in terms of pushing it to the Supreme Court. Here's the case, Harris v. Forklift Systems Incorporated, 1993. Should plaintiffs be forced to prove that they were psychologically harmed in order to persuade a jury that the sexual harassment has occurred? Primarily, the unanimous decision of the court held that it was not necessary for plaintiffs to prove that they had suffered psychological injuries. Because initially that's what the lower courts initially indicated. They had to prove that there was some level of psychological injuries. Supreme Court decision listed several criteria by which to decide whether an action constitutes sexual harassment, including the frequency and severity of the behavior, whether the behavior was physically threatening or humiliating, and whether it would unreasonably interfere with an employee's work performance. Again, that's one of the things you're looking at as well. Is it impacting their work performance? For example, if a person is being harassed at work, are they wanting to come to work? Primarily, no. And will it impact them financially? Yes. Two, does the person feel comfortable even being in the same working environment? And again, all these different factors play into it. And a lot of individuals will initially look at it from the angle of, well, why doesn't the person quit? And if it's a meaningful career, which you want to quit something that you enjoy and do, all because an individual is sexually harassing you. A lot of individuals will be on the fence on this. But one of the things is you're looking at, you want to come to a workplace that is free of harassment. And within that, that's one of the things we're always looking at is the element of safety and security. So Justin O'Connor's opinion suggests that if conduct was not sufficiently severe and pervasive as to create an objectively hostile work environment, as defined by a reasonable person, then it was not sexual harassment. Again, this is Justice O'Connor's, their opinion. Psychologists have attempted, so now we're going to apply it to detect harassment. So again, psychologists have attempted to predict when sexual harassment will occur. In other words, the norms. So here's an example. The norms is a specific organization's function to encourage the expression of harassment. Men who reported higher levels of authoritarian characteristics are more likely to engage in sexual harassment. So initially, if they have an authoritarian characteristic, you begin to see sexual harassment happening in the workplace, and I'm pretty sure you probably see that even on within the workplace itself, and you begin to have a better understanding of how the workplace environment will play out. They found that sexual harassment charges were more likely to be resolved in favor of the complainant. So the harassing behaviors were serious. The complainant had witnesses to support the charges, and the complainant had given notice to management prior to filing formal charges. So within that, you're looking at the element of filing formal charges, and that's always crucial. That's always key. As offenders are victims or claim to be victims. So offenders experience as victims of crime and violence. Some of these defendants have used an abuse excuse, a legal tactic by which the criminal defendant claims a history of abuse as an excuse for violent retaliation. Primarily always trying to go from the area of externalized victimization. And again, externalized victimization kind of goes on both spectrums. But within that, it's primarily the element, well, I was abused, therefore it's my excuse that because I was abused, I'm able to utilize abuse as my initial fallback to carry out the behavior that I'm doing. Such offenses seem to be met with increasing skepticism and with a willingness to blame the offender. Now, what is crisis? So again, we're going to look at all these. There are three components. Precipitating event. Initially, this is something that had happened. This is something that is even ongoing. And so within that, this is the precipitating event. In other words, the catalyst that initially started to implement that element of considering it a crisis. And then it's a subjective distress. So it's not objective, it's primarily subjective. So you yourself are feeling these uniquenesses. And then you have the aspect of your coping methods. Your coping methods may begin to fail. The deep breathing techniques, all these different elements, withdrawing from the initial situation, and when those things fail, you begin to go into what's considered a crisis. Now, precipitating events. So this can be a situational and external event. It's unexpected, sometimes obvious, but sometimes can be difficult to determine. And within that, the factors involved are usually human, technological, or natural. Again, they can also go more internally. So you have spiritual, you have psychological, but again, it goes into the area of human. So initially, that's where you would kind of fall in that. So subjective distress, how we think about what had happened. Some events almost always create crisis. In other words, death of a loved one, violent crime, loss of a loved one, losing a family member, divorce, financial loss, stuff like that. Again, each crisis looks different for different people. Each individual may interpret it differently, and I think we've always seen that. Say, for example, you have individuals who may lose their job, and they're like, you know what, that's fine. I'll find another job. But you have another individual in the same situation, they'll lose their job, and they'll feel like the world is crumbling around them. But the same individual prior, who initially lost their job and thought everything was fine, suddenly may go to the grocery store, and suddenly their favorite cereal is not there, and suddenly they feel like, oh my goodness, the world hates me. Again, each outlook is always going to be interpreted differently. So again, that's where we had to be careful about our own biases. So our bias, a lot of times we're checking ourselves. When we're utilizing a lot of these different theoretical elements, or even these elements of psychological uniquenesses, we're learning to be able to be aware of that. We're always going to have subjective elements, but at the same time, we have to be careful about our own personal biases. Again, you're also looking at timing in the person's life. When is this thing happening? When is that happening? When is this crisis happening? And so that's kind of how you're modeling a lot of your support. The usual coping methods, they initially fail. Event exceeds the person's usual ability to cope. So initially you're looking at all those elements. Say, for example, support group's not there, or say, for example, even just now, for example, the COVID-19. Our usual method is to always be around family, but now suddenly we're told, no, you can't be around family because of COVID. And within that, our support systems sometimes feel like they're crumbling around us, and we feel like the world is against us, which then puts us in that unique element of crisis. Now, some people already use healthy coping skills. So what are these healthy coping skills? One, exercise, listen to music, journaling, talking with others. Some use unhealthy coping skills. Substances, including coffee. I know sometimes individuals look at coffee and they're like, oh, that's not really that bad. Again, it is still considered a drug. It's a legal drug. But again, it's one of those things where even for me, I'm guilty of that. I drink a lot of coffee. But at the same time, we have to be mindful of what our coping skills are. When I'm highly stressed, one of the things I kind of turn to is coffee. And within that, I, one, have to limit myself. Two, I have to make sure that I'm being cognitive of my initial fallibility. As well as overeating. You have individuals who overindulge in different things. They overindulge in food, alcohol, stuff like that. And then there's others who self-harm. Again, this can be unhealthy because when you're causing harm to yourself, it limits your ability to overall cope with the situation. When I used to work with schools, with teenagers, you used to come across this in terms of cutting. You had individuals who would cut, and within that was their ability to feel pain. One, because due to the stressful event of what had happened in their home, they initially had numbed their initial emotional and psychological well-being, and with that numbing factor, the pain of the cutting initially brings them back to initial reality. But again, there's other methods. One of the things you're always looking at is what are the healthy methods. Then you have aggression or violence. Initially, you have individuals starting to lash out, utilizing what they had learned or what they had gone through, and simply utilizing it as a catalyst to carry out additional aggressive acts. Why do crisis reactions vary? You're looking at severity, personal history, coping skills, values, belief system, reaction support from others, suddenness, and access to resources. So on the reservation, one of the things you come across is our abilities to react. On the reservation, you begin to understand that, and I think we've seen that even as individuals, we tend to, because we live so far from the cities and from towns, a lot of times we're always preparing by way of storing things. We store food, we store this, we store that, but and that's the reason why when there's major crisis, a lot of times we're able to react with a sense of ease. But in addition to that, say for example, if you're a single parent and suddenly you lost your job, the suddenness may suddenly hit you. And so when all that happens, your ability to react is stunted, and the ability to search for support from others is limited. So now take into account victims of sexual assault. A lot of times there's that suddenness. My own personal history, how can I look at my life? Are my coping skills there? In addition to that, you also look at the values and the beliefs. What are my current values? How do I view myself now? Is it positive or is it negative? Within that, are there resources around me? Especially during COVID, when I heard accounts of domestic violence cases rising, the ability to access a lot of these resources was limited. Because initially they couldn't send victims to shelters because of the possibility of them contracting the virus. And so all these things played in, and so now you had victims who initially were stuck in proverbial limbo because, one, they weren't able to access a lot of resources. And in addition to that, if you saw the news just recently, a lot of shelters are struggling. A lot of nonprofit shelters are struggling because initially resources are not there. And for a lot of these nonprofits, that's where a lot of victims end up having to go to, are a lot of nonprofit crisis programs. And when those programs initially dry up in terms of resources, then it impacts the victim, and then it has an initial snowball effect. Why do crisis reaction vary? So again, we look through that. Having no warning, making it more difficult to individuals because of the feelings associated with the absolute loss of control. And within that, sometimes, and I'll focus in on suddenness. So having no warning. And that's one of the things is for sexual assault cases, a lot of times there is no warning. And when that happens, there's a loss of control. And so what you're doing for a lot of choice-based behavior and choice-based therapy, you're looking at the aspect of giving that individual control again in small elements so that they're able to say, okay, I can handle this, I can handle that situation, and I know I have the ability to handle it because I have an initial support system. And also changing that belief system. So within that, you have the reaction support. You want to make sure that there is a quality support. For example, a DV victim may purposely isolate herself to avoid explaining her physical injuries, which then leads to their lack of support, which then leads to greater difficulty during and after their initial traumatic situation. The reason why I say this is even for victims who had been badly beaten, a lot of times having to reach out, even when they would come to programs like domestic violence shelters, a lot of times even for them, they're fearful of how people will react to them. Because initially, a lot of times, victims are looking at it from the angle of, I will be judged. I will be judged by my appearance. I will be judged by how I'm taking care of my kids. And again, one of the things you're always looking at is that support system saying, okay, I see you, I want to help you, and I'm here for you. So the physiological reactions to trauma. So again, the body is flooded with hormones, epinephrine, cortisol, and oxytocin. Brain often reverts to basic survival mode. And that's one of the things is that fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so the acute stress responses. So you have increased heart rate, blood flow, even the airways become more constricted. That's the reason why when you're in a highly stressful environment, a lot of times your heart rate increases, your airways constrict to the point where you feel like you're about to pass out. Then your low sensitivity to pain, and then it inhibits your ability to encode. I think we talked about that. I think it was the last chapter we were talking about encoding. So your ability to see and also remember things is stunted. It's limited. Within that, within your brain, it shuts down. So the cerebral cortex initially shuts down, and higher level thinking initially breaks down as well in terms of your language, your logic. That's the reason why you have individuals who are simply coming from the angle of, why didn't they yell out? Why didn't they yell out no? If they were being assaulted, why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that? And again, as noted, a lot of times sexual assaults are very sudden. It's not like there was a pre-planned element. And primarily from the rapist, initially there was that pre-planned element, but for the victim, a lot of times there was not the initial. It is very sudden, and so within that, your brain initially compacts. Parasympathetic nervous system and all the sympathetic nervous system initially clash. So initially, that's the other element. Intermediate and brainstem take over. So the heartbeat, breathing, emotions, and aggression. So within that, you have the acute stress response: fight, flight. Then you have the physiological reaction to crisis: sensory input, impact, and triggers. So it impacts your touch, taste, smell, hearing, and sight. So within that, what are the long-term and the immediate? So the increased heart rate, clenching of the jaw, heightened senses, dry lips and mouth, hyperventilation, headaches, body relieves, self. And one of the things is if a person is in a highly stressful situation, a lot of times you have individuals who will defecate or even urinate on themselves as they're trying to flee, because one, initially your body's trying to release all this so that it's able to free itself any excess weight so it can get out of that initial trauma environment. In addition to that, you have long-term trouble sleeping, eating disturbances, low energy, sexual dysfunction, as well as chronic pain. Then you have gastrointestinal symptoms. In other words, your stomach is, you have IBM, irritable bowel syndrome. You have all these different elements. Initially, your body is becoming constipated. All these different elements are playing in. Then substance abuse. You have individuals turning to different substances to initially numb the pain or to escape the pain, or even having to utilize substances as a form of coping. The cognitive impacts. So memory lapse distorts perception, slow emotion effect, difficulty in making decisions, as well as your decreased ability to focus. There's some element of confusion, seeing event over and over again, playing it out over and over in your mind. The emotional impact is shock, denial, despair, guilt, extreme anxiety, anger, dissociation, withdrawal, as well as intrusive thoughts. So again, these can all be mirrored within PTSD or even acute stress. Again, that's one of the things is there's the initial shock. You feel like, hey, you know what? I was going good in life, and suddenly this happened, and now I'm not so sure anymore. Or you have the denial process, initially looking at it from the angle of, I'm fine, I'm good. Nothing really happened to me anyway. I hear about rape, and I wasn't raped. The physical trauma was not as bad as I imagined, and that's the denial process. Then there's just the despair, initially all out thinking, where you're simply looking at it and saying, you know what, life is grim, life is horrible, life is unfair, and within that, I'm just going to fall farther and farther and farther away. Then there's the guilt. You have victims a lot of times holding on to that guilt. You have police officers who also utilize guilt, and that's one of the things I came across, re-victimization of victims from police officers. Police officers simply saying, you shouldn't have been drinking, you shouldn't have been wearing that. Again, it goes both spectrums. You also had the guilt towards male victims, initially belittling male victims and simply saying, well, you're a guy, you should have been able to get away from the perpetrator, you should have been able to get away from the individual. Again, all of these things play in, and then you have extreme anxiety. The aspect that an individual may simply look at it from the angle of, well, one, I don't want to go out anymore. I'm afraid to go out. I'm afraid that, if I go down such and such route, such and such, the individual may be there. And then you have the other aspect of anger. The individual may simply internalize and say, you know what? I'm going to get back at every individual. I'm going to hate every individual. And then you have disassociation, individuals simply withdrawing within their own mind and coming up with new elements of repression, new elements of dissociation to the point where the individual now has created another world for themselves. In addition to that, you have the withdrawal. A person simply says, you know what, I'm just going to become a recluse and not come out because initially the world has always been a horrible place. And then you have intrusive thoughts. So again, you have times where you're going by in your everyday life. Say, for example, you enter a new relationship, but if it had been domestic violence, you already have those intrusive thoughts of maybe this person is just like the last person I dated. Maybe they're just as abusive as the last person. And then you end up ending relationships before they even begin to blossom because initially there's that fear. And one of the things I always look at is before entering a new relationship, whether it be sexual assault or domestic violence, is to always ensure that you are ready and making sure that that relationship is going to be for you. Because again, one of the things is if you enter a relationship and you're simply looking at it as filling a void, what's going to happen is you may end up relapsing. You may end up placing all the blame on that new individual who may not even know what had happened. And so that's one of the things you're always looking at is the aspect of making sure that those intrusive thoughts are dealt with, whether through therapy or through some form of support. So now, living on the reservation, one of the uniquenesses has been housing and homelessness. So on the reservation, you start to see that extreme poverty, substance abuse within the home, vulnerability of age, and naivety. Again, there's also the desire for a better life. A lot of times there's single parent home life, lack of direction and input, whether by parents or self, as well as the rurality of help and resources. So all this can play into the ability to make logical and rational decisions. Now, is there a cookie cutter victim? And again, I heard this before. It was a police officer who initially told a victim, "Oh, you are the perfect victim." And I've never heard this ever again. It's been one of those uniquenesses where when I heard it, I was like, wow, I did not know there was perfect victims. Initially, it was like a checkbox that you were just initially checking off. Again, each victim is very unique. They come from different socioeconomic status, they come from different outlooks, and they come from different viewpoints. And one of the things you're always looking at is trying to make sure that you are supporting the individual and making sure that you're not calling them the perfect victim, as this police officer did. And I was stunned, I was blown away. Because initially when I heard it, I was like, wow, this is interesting. Um, what can you do if you are in an abusive relationship? When tension starts building, one, pay attention to your feelings. Are you tense, fearful, or on edge? Two, don't minimize or deny the danger that is happening. A lot of times we look at gut reaction. If you feel like it's starting to happen, don't try to argue or reason. One of the biggest things I always tell people is to get out of that situation. Because initially you're not trying to change the person's mind. Initially, or the behavior, simply trying to get away. In addition to that, realize you deserve better. Get out of the situation safely as soon as you can. Call 911. On the reservation, you have local Chinle police, and I have the police PD number there, 928-674-2111 and 2112. On campus, you also have additional numbers for security if you're living on campus, whether it be the family campuses. But again, one of the things I always look at is to look at your local police numbers. Because again, on the reservation, one of the things if you're in Chinle and you call 911, a lot of times it'll send you to dispatch through, say for example, Window Rock or to Shiprock or Kayenta. That's the reason why it's good to always brush up on the numbers that are near you, so that you know the numbers itself. And that's one of the things is always trying to make sure that you have the support needed. If you are a victim, tell someone you trust about what is happening. In other words, seeking help. Seeking that support. If you have been assaulted or abused, report the incident to the police. If you have been injured, seek medical attention immediately. Save all the evidence you can, pictures of injuries and destroyed property, or keep a written journal. If you say, for example, if you get examined over at the local Indian Health Services, a lot of times I always request a lot of the victims to get photographs, to have the physician take photographs, primarily just for their own records and also for your own records. Because again, if you're going to get a restraining order or a temporary protection order or a permanent protection order, um, one of the things you're always looking at, or emergency protection order, my bad. So initially, if you're having to have that, initially, in order for that to happen, a lot of times you're having to defend why you're getting it. And when that happens, it's best to have as much evidence there so as to initially get the temporary protection order granted. If you need to leave or be away from the offender, locate a safe temporary housing. Again, as noted, sometimes even the shelters are initially limited. But in addition to that, when you get away, when you leave that situation, when you're getting, and that's one of the things I always tell a lot of individuals when I'm training advocates, um, is the aspect that when you're educating a lot of victims or victims of these crimes, when you're trying to get away, um, really stress that. And I guess one of the things within this generation of oversharing, a lot of times within our cell phones, we have indicators, we have locators. Um, and I'll give this short story. So initially, this individual, and I'll share the story. So this individual had been taken from an abusive relationship and had been placed in a shelter. And as the person was in the shelter, what the individual had done was begun sharing photos outside of the shelter. So they had the kids all, the individual had the kids with them and was doing kind of like a photo shoot or whatever you call it. So initially they were sharing, I'm over here and all this and that, under the assumption that initially they had blocked the perpetrator from social media and everything else, but forgetting that some of the friends had also that some of the friends knew the perpetrator, and so they immediately contacted the perpetrator. The perpetrator then found out where their location was, which then compromised the victim and put them in danger again. And so initially the shelter had to relocate them to another location. And that's one of the things it seems simple. It seems very simplistic. But again, one of the things I always try to tell a lot of victims if they're having to leave an abusive relationship is to pack the necessities. We used to always go through what is considered safety planning. And within safety planning, and I won't necessarily go in depth with it right in here, but with safety planning, you're always looking at the parameters. You're looking at things that you can get safely away. Again, you're looking at important documents. Say, for example, ID, CIB, school records, even EBT cards, or even EBT information. And looking at all these different factors to make sure that when they do leave that abusive relationship, at least they have a backup system. Because again, as I noted, I think it was in last or at the beginning of this, how a lot of times perpetrators will utilize a lot of power and control over the victim in terms of hanging on to those crucial documents or hanging on to those crucial debit cards, stuff like that. And so within that, sometimes it limits the victim's ability to get away. And lastly, seeking order of protection. Again, some victims look at it as, well, it's just a piece of paper. How's a piece of paper going to help me? Again, it's one, to show to the police that yes, this is in place. Two, it reiterates the fact that this has been an ongoing incident, and for that reason, I need the individual to now be placed in custody because their initial behavior has become very dangerous. And again, it also creates that paper trail. Initially, that's what you're primarily trying to do, so that you're kept safe. What if you notice the abuse as a friend? What can you do? Do and don'ts. So do is in the black. So it's to the left. Ask if something is wrong. Do express concern. Listen and validate. Do offers help. Do support his or her decisions on what they want to do. Again, that's one of the things is sometimes as individuals, we like to give advice. We like to say, you know what, this is what I would do and this is what I need to do. Again, they're individuals themselves. A lot of times, if you're working with an adult, that's primarily what you're looking at. If it's a child, there's a whole other element that I'll be looking at later on in the course in terms of, I believe, it's child sexual assaults. And I think we did cover that in terms of supporting the element of child protective services, stuff like that. But within adults, you're looking at the aspect of supporting their decision. So even if, say, for example, they want to return back to that abusive relationship, there is nothing you can do to change that mindset because, again, for them, they feel like, hey, you know what, I want to go back. And I know it goes against their best interest, but a lot of times we're looking at it from the angle of, well, why would you want to go back to an abusive relationship? Again, for that individual, they're looking at survival. And so that's where we always look at that. We look at and want to make sure that we're supporting them and hope that we offer enough support to them and also enough resources in front of them so that if they are and when they are ready to leave, they have the necessary tools. And then don't wait for him or her to come to you, judge or blame. Don't pressure him or her. Don't give advice. Don't place conditions on your support. Initially, I used to hear this a lot when I used to work with individuals. They would say, you know what, I've helped you so many times, and within that, if you don't leave, then I won't help you. If you don't leave, then I won't give your kids food. Or if you don't leave, then this is what I'm gonna do. Because again, initially you're placing conditions on your support. One of the biggest things a person will initially leave when they're ready to leave. Tips of support. One, I believe you. It took a lot of courage to tell someone about this. Two, it's not your fault. You didn't do anything to deserve this. Three, you are not alone. I care about you and I'm here to listen or help in any way I can. And four, I'm sorry this happened. This shouldn't have happened to you. One of the biggest things is you're looking at different elements. And each one will apply differently. Again, you're looking at the element of what would work in that situation. One may work better, one may not work as good. Again, you're having to utilize the different elements of support. And again, that's one of the things you're always looking at. Continued support. Avoid judgment. Check in periodically and know your resources. When I used to work with DV victims, that's one of the things I was always looking at was knowing my initial resources. Say, for example, if I'm giving them a number to a shelter, hopefully that shelter number better be up to date. Or making sure that if I'm going to utilize different resources, making sure that those resources are kept up to date. In addition, just check in periodically. Say, hey, I'm still here for you if you want to talk. If you need to talk and vent and everything else, I'm here. If you need to discuss something, I'm here. In addition to that, avoiding judgment, simply saying, you know what, maybe you are really like that. Again, that's where the judgment kind of comes in, and kind of just looking at it from their angle of saying, okay, you know what, I'm still here for you. And if you need to check in, great. And then lastly, respect, RESPECT. Respect a person's right to say no. Respect and embrace diversity. Respect your partner or significant other. Respect the choices that victims and survivors make to survive. Respect different lifestyles. And lastly, hoping, healing, and facing trauma. Each individual may approach trauma differently, but the ability to be that support is crucial in seeing success. Again, it's one of those uniquenesses, and I can go a lot longer in regards to domestic violence, and I know I'm a big believer in all the different elements regarding domestic violence, and that's the reason why I love teaching on domestic violence. If I could, I would make this whole course about domestic violence and teaching on those elements. And maybe for future courses, that's kind of how we can look at it. But within that, that's one of the things I covered in this chapter. So if you have any questions, be sure to send me an email, and we'll leave it at that. So have a good day. Be awesome. Be amazing. Change the world.